So today we're going to talk about applying textures to your digital painting, more specifically like fleshy creature designs, but these same ideas can be applied to different textures. Here are 5 tips to improve your texture rendering. Tip number 1, follow the form. Let me just start off by saying I think composition and form are more important than textures, but textures still do play a big part of your painting. What helps me a lot with understanding what I'm drawing is kind of drawing this cross contour grid. That way I can see how it wraps around my object or subject. If you can make these simple cross contour lines look pretty believable, then you're in a pretty good spot. If you're struggling with trying to do cross contour lines, I would say try to practice a little bit more with 1-point and 2-point perspective and just work on drawing forms, and then eventually you'll be able to visualize how to dissect your objects into planes. Don't get me wrong, you can brute force textures and still have a cool aesthetic, but if you're struggling and you want your artwork to look more 3D, this will help you out a lot. Tip number 2, match your silhouette with textures. So a lot of times people kind of view textures as a secondary thing. So they'll draw their objects and then they'll just slap on the texture. Let's look at bricks. So if you look at bricks, they have these little indents and that's going to show up in its silhouette. Another example is look at this scorn looking texture. So this is it without the silhouette and it looks fine. And then this is it when we add bumps and match the silhouette, and you notice it kind of adds a lot. So if you can do that for your main subjects, it's definitely going to help everything look more cohesive. When you start to go farther back, this isn't as important because you're going to lose details, but your focus point, having those ridges and crevices and bumps will really help sell the idea of it being 3D. Tip number 3, the figure 8 method. This works great for creature skins like octopus or even just human skin. You just have to tone it down a lot. But if you're trying to do exorcism style skin where you want it to look really dark and uncanny, this method is perfect. And essentially what you're going to do is you're going to take an airbrush tool, you're going to lower down the opacity, lower down the flow, and you're just going to make this figure 8, and you're just going to keep on doing that, and it's going to add these natural little grooves into whatever you're trying to render. And I kind of use this as an underpainting. Obviously you're gonna have to do a lot of refining, but this is a good start to kind of just get the feeling of your painting. Just try not to go overboard and just remember your overall shadow and form, because it's very easy for making this texture to override your previous shading. So if you have it in the bottom layer and then if you have a multiplier layer on top, you can kind of bring back your form and definition. Tip number 4, detail in clusters. So this kind of falls under composition, but I still think it's very important when it comes to texturing because you're adding all these little details and it's very easy to overwhelm the eye. I like to focus on focal points and then make my cluster of details, and then areas that are not important, just kind of leave it up to the reader's mind, because your mind is going to fill in a lot of gaps that you don't have to render out. And then go back to other areas and make a little cluster of details for people to rest on, and then give them some negative space to not be overwhelmed. Another good thing to think about is big, medium, and small. So you want maybe a big hole, then a medium hole, and a small hole, and put those in the clusters, and then it'll help give your drawing just a little bit of rhythm. That's kind of what I like to do. Not only does it save you time, it also doesn't overwhelm your viewers, and it's kind of a win-win on both situations. It's good to have texture and details, but sometimes too much of it can overwhelm the viewer. So it's kind of this push and pull, and you kind of just have to do what you feel is right. And sometimes less is more. Tip number 5, photobashing your textures. So this kind of really depends on what art style you're going into, but sometimes photobashing gives me a good starting point to do an overpaint on, and then other times it just gives it just a little bit more noise grain detail. And sometimes I like to do just a very subtle photo bash, and it makes everything not look as unified. Just remember, when you're plopping in these textures, try to have it match the form. You can definitely get away with it by just plopping down and doing an overpaint, but what helps me a lot is I take my texture, I put it in, and then I match the perspective with this box using the transform tool. Just press Ctrl T, and then you're able to drag these corners. You might have to hold Control to adjust it a little bit. And then for the spear, what I did is I plopped it in, and then I went to the liquefy tool and I kind of just pushed in the corners, so it kind of has this warp around to it, and that definitely helps sell the illusion. There's many ways you can go about photo bashing. Some people put in the texture first and then kind of work around it, and then other people have their form and they kind of force the textures to work with what they have. Also play around with the blending mode. Sometimes overlay and soft light does wonders. Another thing I like to do is I like to bring it to like black and white. If I want it to be very pixelated, I'll throw a threshold filter, but making it black and white, adjusting the curves, and then put it under multiply, and that's gonna like make these like cool little pockets. And for like horror stuff, that's kind of what I like to do. I like to make it under, I like to crunch down the values and then put it under a multiply and then lower down the opacity. And then another thing I do is I take that and I erase some of the details so it matches my form a little bit. All right, so let's apply all this information now. In this example, I'm gonna do one of my pages from a webcomic I've been working on called GMO World. So I just want to iterate this. Like, you can have the best textures in the world, but if your form and composition are lacking, the rest of your piece is probably going to be lacking. And you know, there's probably an exception to this, but I would say it's more important to focus on the overall composition and form, and then think of textures as more of a secondary element. Also, in my opinion, it's a lot easier to like paint in textures rather than doing like line art version of like distressed textures, because it's a lot more time consuming. And then with painting, you kind of just like go with the flow. So if you look at this drawing over here, I'm kind of like drawing in these individual like scuffs and marks, and it's very time consuming and I don't recommend it. And I always end up doing this to myself, where I'm really just, I get like tunnel brain and I focus too much on like these itty bitty textures that I'm just gonna paint over. It all depends on the style, but if you can help it, try not to draw in your textures with your liner, because once you add color and once you do the texturing over it, it's just going to be covered. But it really just depends on the art style. I masked off my line work and now I'm adding this gross texture from Google Image. I made a black and white and I put it under a multiply layer and I erased some of the details. And then I'm also filling in my blackout shadows, and what this does is it gives my artwork just a little bit of negative space, and it also saves me time because now I don't have to render in all these details that are going to be in shadow. For the longest time I was afraid of negative space, but negative space is a good thing and it gives the reader just a little bit of space to breathe. As far as my texture order goes, so first I do like the photo bashing, and then I do like a figure 8 airbrush, and then after that I black out and I carve out some like chunks of shadow, and then on top of that layer I like to do like veins and then like little dirt speckles, and then after that I like to do like a half tone, and you kind of just like push and pull all these values. Sometimes I like to use like this like smudge tool and that helps a lot. But generally, I'm just playing around with these, and then I'm just making sure that my texture isn't overtaking my actual form. Another thing that helps with detailing is adding little specular highlights. So I like to go in with like a liner brush, put it to pure white, and add this like little speckles of white dots. And then I like to draw lines and make it look like saliva, and that usually adds a lot to a painting. And then sometimes I take a flat hard brush and just have spots of just flat colors, and it helps break up all the little bitty details. Another thing that helps me a lot, it's called artifacting. Artem Slop does it a lot, but it's essentially leaving in some of your old sketch work into the final piece. And for me, I like to add like giant X's and squares and circles, and for some reason it just gives it a little bit of charm. I don't know why it works, but it kind of just helped with my style. So if you just go around in like little areas, just add little X's and like little outline of circles, it kind of helps. Now I'm finishing up the painting. I'm just adding some fogs and dust and particles, and it just helps bring everything alive. I like to add bloom. It's very easy to do. Go to select color range, select white, and then make on a new layer, color everything with white, and then add a Gaussian blur, and that's how you can do easy bloom. Just lower down the opacity. You can do it to hard light, but it's going to help your paintings out a lot. So this is the final results. The textures definitely added a lot. Just remember to keep the form and you're mostly all good to go. If you guys like this photo bashing technique, check out this video where I use a little bit of photo bashing to make this cool background. Anyways guys, I hope you guys have a good one and take care.